$44 billion, the largest single loan in the history of the International Monetary Fund. The borrower was Argentina. The year of the original commitment was 2018. Every system has an architecture. Most people see the facade. This is what is underneath. 6 years later, Argentina is still paying interest on that loan, but the currency moving across the wire is not American dollars, it is Chinese yuan. The IMF does not issue yuan. The IMF does not control yuan. The transaction is happening anyway. Under the rules of the Bretton Woods order, signed in 1944, this transaction should not exist. It exists because the order is being rewritten in real time. One transaction at a time, one sovereign at a time. The IMF has not collapsed. It has not been dissolved. The headlines do not announce its end. And yet in the ledgers that actually matter, something is happening that the press releases never described. The institution is being uninstalled. This is the record of how that uninstallation began with a country that has defaulted 5 times in 70 years, and whose largest creditor is an institution it can no longer afford to obey. The International Monetary Fund was not a neutral creation. In July of 1944, in a hotel in New Hampshire, 2 men argued for 3 weeks about the architecture of the post-war financial world. John Maynard Keynes represented Britain. Harry Dexter White represented the United States Treasury. Keynes wanted a global clearing union with a neutral reserve unit nobody owned. White wanted something else. He wanted an institution headquartered in Washington, denominated in dollars, governed by quotas weighted toward American capital. White won. Britain was bankrupt. The United States held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The terms were not negotiated between equals. They were dictated to a debtor by its banker. The IMF that emerged was, by design, an Anglo-American instrument. It was funded by member quotas, but the United States held veto power. Major decisions required 85% supermajority approval. The American share then and now is just over 16%. One country, one veto. For 70 years, this architecture functioned as intended. When a developing nation faced a balance of payments crisis, the IMF arrived with conditional lending. Loans came with structural adjustment requirements: open your capital account, privatize state assets, devalue your currency, cut public spending. The terms were called the Washington Consensus, and the name was not metaphor. They were written in Washington. They were enforced from Washington. The borrower had no leverage to refuse. This was not exploitation. This was design. The architecture of post-war dollar hegemony required a lender of last resort that disciplined sovereigns into the dollar system. The IMF was that lender. It was, in the most literal sense, the buyer of compliance. For most of the 20th century, the system held. There was no alternative. That has changed. Argentina is the most instructive case in the IMF's modern history, not because it is unique, because it is honest about what the relationship actually is. Since 1956, Argentina has signed 22 separate IMF programs. It has defaulted or restructured under 5 of them: 1982, 1989, 2001, a partial restructuring in 2014, a formal default in 2020. The total cumulative lending across those 70 years exceeds $80 billion in real terms. Today, even after 7 decades of programs, Argentina remains the IMF's single largest debtor, roughly $41 billion outstanding as of the first quarter of 2026. Approximately 26% of the entire active IMF lending book sits in one country on one continent, with one repayment history that includes 5 defaults. This is not a story about a country that cannot manage its finances. The Argentine treasury contains some of the most sophisticated technocrats in Latin America. The country is a top 5 global agricultural exporter. It sits on the 2nd largest shale gas reserves on the planet. The lithium triangle that will fuel the next generation of batteries crosses its northern provinces. This is a story about an institution that cannot stop lending to a borrower. It cannot collect from. In 2018, under President Mauricio Macri, the IMF approved a $57 billion standby arrangement, the largest loan in IMF history. Less than 2 years later, Argentina defaulted again. In March of 2022, the loan was restructured into a $44 billion extended fund facility. The same money, a new wrapper. The principal had not been repaid. It had simply been renamed. The pattern is not failure. The pattern is dependency. The IMF cannot write the loan off, because writing off $41 billion would crater its balance sheet and signal to every other sovereign borrower that default is rewarded. The IMF cannot collect because Argentina genuinely cannot pay in dollars without crushing its real economy. So the loan is rolled. And rolled. And rolled. This is the relationship the institution has with its largest customer. The dependency is not accidental, the dependency is cultivated. But here's what the record actually shows. Argentina has found a way to make the interest payments without using the dollars it does not have. In June of 2023, Argentina did something the architects of Bretton Woods never anticipated. It paid the IMF in Chinese yuan. The mechanism was a bilateral currency swap line between the People's Bank of China and the Banco Central de la República Argentina. The swap had been quietly active since 2009, expanded in 2014, expanded again in 2018, and again in 2023. By the end of 2025, the active swap totaled approximately $18 billion equivalent, 130 billion yuan. In June of 2023, Argentina activated approximately $1 billion equivalent of the swap. It converted yuan into special drawing rights inside the IMF accounting system. The interest payment was made, the IMF received the funds, the transaction settled. Read that sequence again. A sovereign borrower facing a dollar liquidity crisis paid the dollar-denominated lender of last resort using a currency that the lender does not issue, does not regulate, and cannot demand. The Bretton Woods premise was that the IMF's clients required IMF money because IMF money was dollar adjacent and dollars were the only currency that mattered. The Argentina yuan transaction violates that premise directly. It does not negotiate it, it does not amend it, it violates it, and the institution had no procedural objection because there was nothing in the founding charter that anticipated a member state paying its dues in a currency outside the system. The transaction was repeated multiple times across 2023 and 2024. Each time, the precedent hardened. Each time, the architectural exception became less exceptional. By the fourth quarter of 2025, the yuan share of Argentina's central bank reserves had risen to approximately 9%, up from less than 1% at the start of the decade. China is now Argentina's second largest trading partner, surpassing the United States in 2024. Yuan-denominated trade settlement between the two countries grew from under $2 billion in 2020 to approximately $15 billion in 2025. This is not a side experiment, this is a parallel circuit being built around the existing one. The IMF is still in the diagram, but the wires no longer all connect to it. Argentina is not the only sovereign rerouting around the institution that was supposed to be its only option. The new development bank, founded by the BRICS nations in 2015, has approved approximately $35 billion in cumulative lending across its first decade. In 2024 alone, it committed $8.1 billion in new loans. A record year, its membership has expanded beyond the original 5. Bangladesh, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Uruguay, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, and Iran are pending. Approximately 30% of its current lending is denominated in local currencies rather than dollars. The internal target is 50% by 2030. In 2024, Egypt rejected an IMF austerity package and turned to the new development bank instead. The loan was $1 billion. The conditions were materially less invasive than what the IMF had offered. The precedent registered immediately across every finance ministry in the developing world. In 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its sovereign debt. The IMF arrived. So did Beijing. China unilaterally restructured Sri Lankan obligations outside of the IMF process on terms negotiated bilaterally with no Washington consensus conditionality. The Sri Lankan government did not have to choose between the two. It received support from both. The IMF was no longer the gatekeeper. It was one option among several. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, founded in 2016, has now approved over $50 billion in lending across 100 sovereign borrowers. The Gulf Cooperation Council's sovereign wealth funds, holding combined assets approaching $4 trillion, have begun providing direct bilateral support to allied governments without IMF involvement. The pattern is not regional, it is structural. For 70 years, the IMF was the only game when dollar liquidity disappeared. Today, it is one of perhaps 6, a monopoly that becomes a competitor does not announce its decline. The decline is visible only in the shrinking share of business it captures from each new crisis. In November of 2023, Argentina elected Javier Milei ran on a platform that included formally dollarizing the Argentine economy. By the first quarter of 2026, the architectural milestone is approaching. Currency controls have been progressively relaxed. Inflation has fallen from 211% annually to approximately 25%. The 8th IMF review released a $5 billion disbursement in the fourth quarter of 2025. A casual observer would conclude that Milei's administration represents a recommitment to the dollar system. The opposite is true. Dollarization, in the Millii sense, is not the IMF model of dollar discipline. It is the elimination of an independent monetary authority. If the Argentine central bank ceases to issue currency, there is no central bank to discipline. There is no exchange rate to defend. There is no balance of payments crisis in the traditional sense, because there is no Argentine currency to defend or devalue. The IMF's primary tool, conditional lending tied to monetary policy reform, becomes inapplicable. Paradoxically, dollarization weakens the IMF's leverage over Argentina more than continued peso volatility ever did, and the calculation in Washington has shifted to match in 2025. Under Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the United States quietly recalibrated its approach to IMF doctrine. Bessent, a veteran of Soros fund management and a longtime observer of sovereign debt dynamics, has signaled in multiple public addresses that the institution's role in the next decade will be diminished from what it was in the last. The new doctrine is less interventionist, less conditional, more transactional. The IMF as enforcement agency is being downgraded to the IMF as residual claimant. Bessent is not announcing the IMF's death. He is reading its diminishing returns. When the senior shareholder of an institution begins reducing its expectations of that institution, the institution is not yet dead. It is simply being repriced, and the repricing is downward. Kristalina Georgieva, re-elected as managing director in the third quarter of 2024, presides over an institution whose largest client pays its interest in a currency the institution does not issue, whose major shareholder has begun to deprioritize its enforcement role, and whose competitor banks are quietly absorbing the most lucrative emerging market business. This is not collapse, this is becoming irrelevant. In 1956, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to seize the Suez Canal. The military operation succeeded, the political operation failed. The United States Treasury, working through the IMF, threatened to withhold emergency financing from the British pound, which was under speculative attack. Within days, London withdrew from Suez. That moment is conventionally described as the end of the British Empire. The empire did not collapse on a single day. Its institutions did not dissolve. The Royal Navy was not sunk. But on a specific Tuesday in November, the world received confirmation that the empire's instruments of power had been quietly reassigned to Washington. The transfer had been underway for years. Suez was simply the first transaction conducted in plain sight. Hegemonic transitions rarely announce themselves. They are documented, after the fact, by economic historians. They occur in the decade between when the old hegemon stops being able to enforce and when the new hegemon is recognized as the enforcer. In that decade, the institutions of the old order continue to exist, continue to publish press releases, continue to hold conferences. They simply stop being where the decisions actually get made. The IMF in 2026 is in that decade. It has not collapsed. It will not collapse. Its building still stands at 1900 Pennsylvania Avenue. Its annual meetings still draw finance ministers. Its press releases still describe quotas, reviews, disbursements, but the marginal sovereign borrower in distress in 2026 does not call only Washington. They call Beijing. They call the New Development Bank. They call Riyadh. The IMF is on the call list. It is no longer the call. Institutions do not die by collapse. They die by becoming irrelevant. The borrower no longer asks. The lender no longer matters. The architecture is replaced before anyone announces it. Institutions do not die by collapse. They die by becoming irrelevant. Institutions do not die by collapse. They die by becoming irrelevant. The $44 billion loan is still on the IMF books. Argentina is still making payments. The yuan is still moving. The architecture slowly and without announcement is being uninstalled. This was Chapter 9 of the Dominion Archive. The system keeps moving. So do we. Until next time, question the architecture. Money, power, collapse. Dominion does not speculate. We trace